Racist female cop sentenced to life in prison for pointing a gun at a military man general during a funeral. They say respect is earned. But that day, respect was demanded and violently denied. Why are you standing when you should be? Kneeling? The officer barked sharply, her finger twitching on the trigger as she leveled her gun at a man standing calmly amidst the mourners. The crowd fell silent, frozen by shock and disbelief, as the officer shouted orders that echoed across the solemn cemetery grounds. She needed no reason, no justification beyond the color of his skin and the defiant calm in his stance. But what she didn't know was that the man she threatened was Colonel James Mitchell, a respected war veteran, decorated for bravery and honored by every officer in the military. That morning, under the heavy gray skies of Fort Rosewood National Cemetery, a sacred silence was shattered. The flag-draped coffin sat at the center of the ceremony, a symbol of sacrifice and honor. Families gathered, faces etched with grief and pride, the weight of loss pressing on their shoulders. Every step, every breath was measured, because this was not just a funeral. It was a hallowed moment where respect was the only language spoken. But Officer Natalie Evans, with her uniform tight and her eyes cold, chose to rewrite the rules. She strode toward Colonel Mitchell, blocking his path without hesitation. Her hand slapped the hood of his car, an act of dominance disguised as security protocol. The sharp crack echoed like a slap to the face of every witness. Nearby, a young soldier holding the ceremonial flag flinched, his grip faltering as the wooden pole clattered against the ground. A child seated in the front row and dressed in a miniature uniform looked up wide-eyed and whispered to his mother, "Why is that lady yelling at him?" His mother's eyes welled up, but she said nothing, her fingers clenching tightly on her lap, holding back tears for more than just the fallen soldier. Colonel Mitchell remained still, unshaken, unbroken. His steady gaze locked onto Natalie Evans' raised hand, the tension thick enough to cut through the mist that hung over the grounds. What happened next would ignite a firestorm far beyond this quiet ceremony, because this time the law wouldn't hide behind the badge. This time, justice would speak, louder than fear. The air was thick with unspoken grief, a fragile silence hanging over Fort Rosewood National Cemetery, like a fragile glass dome ready to shatter. This was supposed to be a place of peace, where families could mourn without fear, where honor was the only sound breaking the stillness. But that morning, peace was shattered. Natalie Evans, the officer assigned to maintain order, had crossed a line no uniform should ever cross. Her voice, sharp and unyielding, echoed over the solemn grounds as she barked orders at Colonel Mitchell. "Step back! You don't belong here standing like that!" she snapped, the accusation burning beneath her words like a slow fire. The colonel's jaw tightened, his eyes calm but firm. He had faced danger in battlefields far from this quiet place, yet here he faced a different kind of threat, one born not from enemy fire, but from prejudice cloaked in authority. Around them, the mourners held their breath. Mothers held children closer. Veterans shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The flag-draped coffin rested at the center, a silent reminder of sacrifice and dignity. This was a sacred space, a hallowed ground where respect was owed, no matter what. But Officer Evans seemed blind to that sacredness. Her hand hovered near her holstered weapon, the tension in her stance screaming that she was ready to escalate, ready to let fear and bias dictate her actions. When she grabbed his arm roughly, pushing him back, it wasn't just a physical shove, it was a brutal reminder that for some, respect must be demanded through fear. The crowd flinched, a collective gasp rising as shock rippled through the rows of mourners. The young soldier holding the flag dropped his grip, the pole hitting the ground with a jarring crack that broke the heavy silence. A small boy dressed in a miniature uniform like the soldiers around him looked up at his mother with wide, innocent eyes. "Why is she treating him like that?" he whispered. His mother's fingers trembled as she wiped away a tear. She wanted to answer, to explain the harsh realities of a world still wrestling with injustice, but words failed her. Colonel Mitchell stood steady, refusing to give her the satisfaction of submission. In that moment, beneath the heavy gray sky and the watchful eyes of history, it became clear. This was not just a confrontation between a man and a cop. It was a battle between honor and fear, between justice and prejudice. The woman at the center of the storm stood rigid, her posture sharp, her eyes cold as steel. Officer Natalie Evans wasn't just any cop. She carried herself like a judge, jury and executioner wrapped in a badge that seemed too heavy for the weight of her conscience. She was known in the department for her iron fist, the kind of officer who ruled by intimidation rather than respect. Yet here, in this solemn cemetery, her authority felt like a weapon drawn without cause, wielded without permission from the very people she was supposed to protect. Her dark uniform, spotless and pressed, bore a patch that read, Fort Rosewood. Police department, a symbol meant to reassure, but now twisted into a mask of fear. Around her, whispers floated like ghosts. Some called her the Enforcer, a nickname earned by countless incidents where she overstepped bounds, where her judgment was clouded by bias. Others whispered rumors of complaints, too many to ignore, yet she remained untouchable, shielded by a department reluctant to face its own reflection. But today was different. Natalie's sharp glare scanned the crowd, zeroing in on Colonel James Mitchell, an Army veteran with decades of service and medals that spoke of bravery, sacrifice, and leadership. To her, he wasn't the hero everyone else saw. In her eyes, he was a threat, a challenge to her control. Her hand twitched near her holstered weapon as if the slightest defiance could justify drawing it. This wasn't about law or order. It was about power taken without rightful permission. No, one had given her the authority to intimidate a decorated officer during a funeral. No one had signed off on turning a place of mourning into a battleground. But Natalie Evans acted as if the badge made her above the law, above honor, above respect. And the crowd felt it. The air grew heavier as murmurs of disbelief spread among the mourners. Families who came seeking solace now faced the cruel sting of injustice dressed in blue. Yet, through it all, Colonel Mitchell stood his ground. His calm defiance wasn't just for himself. It was for every soldier, every family member, every person who believed that dignity should never be taken by force. Natalie's face tightened, the mask of control slipping ever so slightly. Behind her eyes, doubt flickered, but it was quickly swallowed by the fierce grip of denial. This was a moment where true authority was tested, and it wasn't the one granted by a badge or uniform. It was the authority that comes from standing, up for what's right, even when the system tries to silence you. The tension that had been simmering beneath the surface snapped like a live wire. Natalie Evans stepped forward, her voice slicing through the solemn silence like a whip cracking in the night. "You will step aside, Colonel," she barked, her tone sharp, uncompromising. But James Mitchell didn't flinch. His eyes, steady and unyielding, met hers head-on. "This is a funeral," he said quietly but firmly. "Show some respect." Her nostrils flared. The small crowd holding its breath, sensing the fault line widening between order and chaos. Without warning, Natalie's hand shot up, her fingers gripping the cold metal of her service pistol. Gasps echoed through the assembly. Time seemed to freeze. A uniformed officer, entrusted to protect, now aimed a weapon at a man who had led troops through war zones, at a hero who'd earned his place here with honor and sacrifice. "Step back," Natalie shouted, voice shaking with rage. Shock rippled through the mourners. Mothers clutched their children closer. Veterans stiffened. Friends exchanged wide-eyed glances, unsure whether this was some terrible mistake or a nightmare unfolding in real time. James remained still, his calm refusing to break. The line was crossed, not just a breach of protocol, but a betrayal of every unspoken rule that governs respect in moments like these. Natalie's finger hovered dangerously close to the trigger, her judgment clouded by prejudice and fear. It wasn't just a weapon pointed, it was a declaration, an assertion of power. Over dignity, a force wielded not in defense but in intimidation. The murmurs erupted into cries of outrage. "Put the gun down!" someone shouted. But Natalie was lost in a storm of her own making, blind to the faces around her, deaf to the pleas, locked in a moment where authority turned to abuse. And then, something shifted. Among the crowd, a young soldier stepped forward. Hand raised, not in surrender but in protest. "Enough," he said. "This isn't right." That single word broke the spell. Natalie lowered the gun, her breath heavy, eyes wild. But the damage was done. The sacred space was shattered. The line wasn't just crossed, it was trampled underfoot. And the world would never look away again. The moment didn't just fade into silence. It exploded. Someone in the crowd, maybe a family member, maybe a veteran, pulled out their phone. The lens captured the cold, trembling hand of Officer Natalie Evans pointing her gun at General James Mitchell, the tension hanging thick enough to choke on. Within minutes, the video was everywhere. Social media lit up like a wildfire. The clip spread from phone to phone, across city blocks, through states, and around the world. Hashtags erupted overnight. Justice for General Mitchell. Sharks stand with honor. No more abuse. Voices, long silenced by fear, found courage. Ordinary people flooded timelines with outrage, disbelief, and solidarity. Veterans who had marched into battles, parents who had buried children, activists who had fought tirelessly, they all saw something raw, undeniable, and profoundly wrong. News outlets scrambled to cover the story, interviews aired, experts debated. The video became a symbol, a snapshot of a larger battle raging beyond this one funeral. It forced everyone to confront uncomfortable truths about power, race, and respect. But it wasn't just the outrage that made it viral. It was the story beneath the story, the fact that this wasn't just any man or woman in uniform, but a decorated military general, standing tall in the face of blatant abuse. For the first time in a long time, a moment of courage met with blatant. Injustice wasn't buried. It was magnified. Thousands shared the video with a simple message: "This cannot stand." The pressure mounted like a storm brewing on the horizon. Calls for investigations, demands for accountability, and public protests. Swept across the country, generals, politicians, and civil rights leaders spoke out. The viral video became the spark igniting a nationwide reckoning. But amid the roar of the crowd, two people stood at the heart of it all: James Mitchell, the man wronged, and Natalie Evans, the officer whose actions now faced the harshest scrutiny. This was no longer just about a single moment of injustice at a funeral. It was a mirror held up to a nation's conscience. The courtroom was a battlefield, cloaked in silence. Every eye was fixed on the entrance as Officer Natalie Evans was led in, handcuffed and flanked by officers. The air inside was thick with tension, electric, suffocating. This wasn't just a trial, it was a reckoning. General James Mitchell sat tall in the witness box, his posture steady, his eyes calm but unyielding. The weight of a lifetime spent serving his country rested on his shoulders. He wasn't just there to tell what happened. He was there to make sure the truth could no longer be ignored. The prosecutor's voice cut through the room like a razor, sharp and relentless. "This was not an isolated incident," she said. Her words deliberate, meant to dismantle every excuse and every lie. Officer Evans abused her authority. She violated the sacred trust of the uniform she wore, and she did it with a gun pointed at a man who has dedicated his life to protecting this nation. Evans's defense attorney argued coldly, painting her as stressed, overwhelmed, a victim of circumstance. But every time Evans looked at Mitchell, there was no remorse in her eyes, only defiance. Her silence spoke louder than any words she could utter. Then came Mitchell's testimony, a voice calm but resolute. He described the ceremony, the sacredness of the moment, and how in an instant it was shattered by fear disguised as power. "I stood there," Mitchell said steadily. "Not just as a general, but as a man who has fought for the ideals of this country. And I refuse to be intimidated, because when respect is lost, everything else falls apart." The courtroom held its breath. The rawness of his words struck deep. As witnesses took the stand, soldiers, family members, even civilians, the layers of Evans' actions unfolded. Each story added fuel to the fire of public outrage. The disrespect, the abuse, the betrayal of duty, it was all laid bare. Yet, through it all, Evans remained motionless, a fortress of denial. Her silence was a statement of its own, a challenge, to the court and the world watching. Outside, the courtroom was packed. Cameras flashed, reporters murmured, and the public waited, hungry for justice. This confrontation was no longer just about a single act of misconduct. It was about the soul of authority itself. Could the law hold those accountable who hid behind badges but abused their power? Would this trial become a turning point or just another chapter in a long history of silence? Inside that room, every second stretched taut with possibility, and in that stillness, James Mitchell stood, not just as a witness, but as a symbol of defiance against injustice. The courtroom was no longer just a stage for one woman's actions. It had become a battleground exposing a system built on silence, prejudice, and unchecked power. As the trial progressed, cracks began to show in the carefully constructed facade of law enforcement. Internal memos surfaced, documents that spoke of complaints dismissed, reports buried, and colleagues who turned blind eyes. The prosecution revealed a pattern. Officer Natalie Evans wasn't a lone rogue. She was a symptom of a much deeper sickness, one where rules were bent, where uniform granted immunity, and where prejudice was often hidden beneath the veneer of authority. Former officers took the stand, their voices trembling but firm, recounting how officers like Evans were protected by a code that valued loyalty over justice. "It's not just about her," one witness said quietly. "It's about a culture that says protect your own even when they cross the line, even when they threaten the very people they're sworn to protect." The defense fought back hard, desperate to paint the system as fair and just, but the weight of evidence was crushing. Surveillance footage showed Evans ignoring commands, her body language aggressive and threatening. Dispatch records revealed calls from concerned citizens that were dismissed as routine disturbances. The jury saw the truth unfold, clear, undeniable. Meanwhile, the families of those affected watched from the gallery, some with tears, others with clenched jaws. They were not just watching a trial, they were demanding accountability for decades of pain. The judge's gavel struck sharply, echoing through the chamber, a reminder that this was a court of law, but also a test of conscience. Outside, protests flared. The community was waking up, voices rising in unison, refusing to let this moment fade into silence. The mask of the system, once polished and proud, was now cracked, revealing fractures too deep to ignore. This was not just about Officer Evans. This was about justice for every person who had ever been silenced by fear, prejudice, or power. And as the trial moved toward its climax, the question loomed large. Would the law finally break through the mask and hold the system accountable? Or would it fall back into the shadows of complacency? Inside the courtroom, every word spoken was a strike against that mask, and every soul present knew this was more than a trial. It was a reckoning. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to smash that thumbs up and hit subscribe for more unforgettable, emotional, and viral true stories. We want to hear from you. Drop a comment and tell us, where in the world are you watching from?